Thank you very much to the museum for organizing this and for inviting me to participate. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. Hopefully we'll have a great discussion and panel, and we'll get home before the snow starts. And you'll have to excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold, so if I don't sound so great, what can I do? Okay, so I'm going to give you 10, 15 minutes of overview on immigration history and some context for the discussion. So migration is as old as human history. People have always moved to better their condition, to find opportunities, to seek safety. It's as old as human history. I'm not going to go back to the beginning, but I just want to focus here on the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And you can see from this map that people are going all over the world. And that is relatively new in this period, long-distance migration. Now, most of you probably know about the mass migration from Europe to the Americas. That's just one of three major mass migrations that takes place in the world at this time. Some 50 to 58 million people, mostly from Europe, came to the Americas, both North and South America, and another 2.5 million from India, China, Japan, and Africa. That was pretty much a mass labor migration from people from the rural areas of the world migrating to industrializing centers, both within Europe and to the Americas. Now, the second major migration I want to call your attention to is much less known in this country, and that is a comparable migration of 50 million people from India and southern China who migrated to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean Rim, plus another 4 million from Africa, Europe, Northeast Asia, etc. And that is a migration that layered on top of an older migrations in the region, but in response to European colonialism of Southeast Asia and India. So these are people who are now migrating to work on colonial tin and rubber plantations, people involved in the opium trade between India and China, et cetera, et cetera. And third, probably the least known of our major migrations in this period, is that across the Russian Empire, another 50 million people moved from northeastern Asia and Russia to Manchuria, Siberia, Central Asia, and Japan. And for this, I had to cheat a little bit. This migration goes up to 1930. It's a little later than the others, but it is part of the same worldwide movement of millions and millions of people. And the thing I want to say about this is that at this time, there are no state regulations or restrictions on migration. You didn't need a passport, you didn't need a green card. You know, if there was any restrictions, it had to do with your home country restricting your ability to exit, right? And a lot of people who came from Europe in the late 19th century were undocumented in the sense that they didn't have exit permits, and most of them were trying to leave army conscription, like in the Russian Empire or Italy, things like that. But there was no barrier to entry. So let's look a little closer at migration to the United States. I don't know if you can see this. You guys can see this? You see all the arrows, right? But basically, this shows in the period after the Civil War to the early 20th century, huge migrations, not only from Europe, but also from Asia, also from Mexico, also internal migrations, African Americans leaving the South to the urban North, as well as mostly European Americans moving to the West, right, to open the West. So in this era, we have simultaneous mass migrations from all over the world that are coming to build America's industries, agriculture, and cities. So here I want to draw your attention to the fact that over time, the way America has regulated migration has changed, right? And we might think about two regimes of immigration control, one of open borders and one of closed borders. And you'll notice they overlap. But what I mean by open borders is that the borders are normatively open with some exceptions, right? So most people have no trouble getting in. As I said, you don't need a green card, you don't need a passport, but there's some exceptions. And in the 19th century, the exception pertained to people from China. And after World War I, we moved to a regime of closed borders. That is, the borders are normatively closed with some exceptions, right? So there are limited numbers of Europeans who are allowed to come. Asians are shut out altogether, right? And then in 1965, we have a global restriction program. And I'll get back to 1965 in a moment, because that is the era that we live under now. But I think it's important to understand that what the regime we live under now is a closed border system. So, why do people come to America? Well, they come to work. And I think the point I want to make is that historically there's always been a tension between immigrants who come for settlement and for labor, but also that white Anglo society creates racial differences, which is a legacy of African slavery in this country, which is done in order to support a segmentation of the labor market. Okay, so race plays a role in justifying the creation of a low-skilled, low-wage labor market. And this was particularly true in the late 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, when we saw the vast expansion of the American economy, basically done on the backs of unskilled European labor. Now, within that tension, Americans have responded in different ways, and some Americans responded positively to immigrants. We should not have the idea that all Americans, all white Americans, hated immigrants. That's not true. So Jane Addams is probably known to many of you. She started Hull House, which was a program in Chicago in the turn of the century that promoted education. She supported the cultures of immigrants. She supported labor unions. One of her fellow workers at Hull House was Florence Kelly, who was the first factory inspector in Illinois, right? So one of the things Hull House was very interested in was not just the communities and the well-being of children and families, but also the working conditions that immigrants faced. So Kelly was the first factory inspector of Illinois, and she went on to found the National Consumers League, which appealed to consumers that they shouldn't buy products made with sweated labor. Right, so some of her articles are actually kind of funny, like, well, you ladies don't want to buy a fur coat that was sewn in a tenement because you don't know what kind of, insects might be in that coat. And then we have our own, I had to put a New Yorker in here, Lillian Hellman from Henry Street Settlement House. And also this is Donna Linda Cameron, who worked in San Francisco's Chinatown, quote unquote, rescuing young Chinese girls who had been brought over to be prostitutes. But I want to say that in addition to all this positive work done by white Americans, that immigrants themselves were the drivers for social change, right? The Lower East Side has a marvelous, marvelous history of worker activism, and these are Jewish women during one of the big garment strikes in New York City. And I think it's really important that we understand that immigrants fought for themselves, and they had allies, but they fought for themselves. Now, unfortunately, on the other side of the coin, there have been politics of exclusion, that the other side of this tension. The Know Nothing Party of the 1850s was organized around anti-Catholic sentiment, right, especially against Irish, but against all Catholic immigrants. The anti-Chinese movement in the 1870s and 80s. Now this is an interesting cartoon because it's actually not anti-Chinese, right? This is Colombia, right, America, trying to ward off an Irish mob, right? That's kind of a racist caricature. And so I think what this shows us is how the politics of Chinese exclusion was very much tied up with the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Right? This is the 1870s, when the fate of Chinese and the question of racial equality really hinged on what would be the future of African Americans. And when Reconstruction was betrayed or overthrown, and you had the institution of Jim Crow and a system of racial segregation and oppression, that also sealed the fate of the Chinese. At the turn of the century, there was a movement against European immigrants, especially those from Italy, Jews from Russia, Poles, Slavs, etc. And it was said that we had to limit the number, because 25 million people came between 1880 and 1917, and they mostly came without any restriction. There was some regulation, but no numerical restrictions. And the idea then was that America had too many immigrants. It was suffering from indigestion. That was the word that was used. And the things that were said about immigrants in the teens was very much like what we hear today. They're criminals, they don't learn English, they're dirty, you know, they're illiterate, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Very similar to what we hear today. And then, of course, you have the Klan in the 20s. The Klan managed to wrap up in one agenda: hatred of blacks, Jews, and immigrants. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about immigration since 1965. Now, most people think of the 1965 Immigration Act, the Hart-Celler Act, as a liberal law, and it had very important liberal aspects in that it repealed the national origin quotas, right, which restricted the numbers of Europeans coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. But Hart-Celler was in many ways an illiberal law because it imposed global restrictions on immigration, extended numerical restriction to the Western Hemisphere, where there had been none before. So Hart-Celler set a ceiling of 290,000 a year. That's actually a very low number compared to the size of the US population at the time, and compared to, and in light of the fact that we had an expanding economy that needed more labor. Today, that number has gone up some to about a little over 400,000 a year of new quota entries, but there are about 1 million people a year who receive green cards. Now, what's particularly vexing about the 1965 Act is that it says no country can have more than 7% of the total. That's about 26,500 a year. So this is very much, in 1965, this is very much a civil rights act, right? The civil rights was about formal equality. So this is an application of that idea. We're going to treat all countries the same. No country can have more than this number, 7%. Well, think about it. Are all countries the same? If you come from Belgium or New Zealand, you have the same quota as Mexico or India, right? So this was a way to restrict immigration from the global south, right, under the guise of equality, and using preferences, right, 80% for family members, 20% for employment. So this is the single most important reason why we have undocumented immigration, because some countries max out on their quota every year. You can name them. There are 4 countries that max out on their quotas every year. Who can name them? Mexico, right? What else? India, anybody? China, right? The 4th is the Philippines, right? And that's because we have a historical relationship to the Philippines that goes back 100 years. So this is our system now. Now there's a lot of talk in Congress about upending it completely, and we can talk about that more later if people are interested. So let's just look at what immigration to the United States looks like today. Well, since 1965, some 59 million people have come to the United States. 88% come from the global south. Unlike the turn of the 20th century, when most immigrants were, almost all of them were lower skilled people, now we have both higher and lower skilled migrants. And there's men and women, right? There were far more men 100 years ago than there are today. And actually now we have what people call a feminization of migration, with many more women, even women coming without their families to immigrate. Immigrants are now 13% of the US population. I don't know if you think that's a big or small number, but it's not the historical high. The historical high was in the 1910s, it was 15%. They are 17% of the workforce, and unauthorized workers are less than 5% of the workforce. Okay, New York is probably higher, but nationally it's less than 5%. So there's, in a sense, a kind of moral panic associated with immigrants that are flooding our country. They're taking all the jobs. These are not numbers that suggest that immigrants are taking all the jobs. But as I said, we have high levels of unauthorized entry because of the visa system, the quotas. And now, I read something interesting last week. The number of undocumented has gone down. It went down from 12 million to 11 million after the recession, and now it's down to 10 million undocumented. And migration from Mexico is at net zero, right? It's at net zero now. Most of the people coming across the southern border are from Central America. In our own city, we have 3 million foreign-born people. That's 37% of our population, and 775,000 undocumented. So this just gives you a picture. In some ways, New York is atypical of the country as a whole because we have such a large immigrant population. That's always been the case. It's been the case, for over 100 years. And it creates a lot of, some tensions, but also a lot of special opportunities for us. Okay, so let me just end with, here's our hero, with just a few comments on the immigrant rights movement today. I think we live in a very difficult time, but it's also a time where we can see possibilities emerging. And how much hope we read into these things, like it depends on your personality. I like to think that we can be hopeful. What's really important, I think, is that the immigrant rights movement is taking place at all levels. It takes place in our city government, in our state government. It takes place in the federal courts, and it takes place on the streets with direct action, mass support. And I think, many of the important litigation that has yet to get to the Supreme Court that has to do with DACA, the Muslim ban, many of these things, ICE deportations, grabbing people that can't say goodbye, all these things, a lot of it is emanating out of New York. So we have a lot going on here, and I really look forward to our conversation. So thank you. So I'd like to ask the panelists to come up to the stage, and Matt Katz will lead us in a conversation.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming. Am I on? Maybe? Yeah, there we go. Thanks for coming before the storm. Whatever you learn here tonight, it will outlast you, the Snowmageddon, I promised. This topic and this discussion is going to be pertinent for weeks and months and years to come. Mae, thank you for that. That was amazing. Maybe I should just go down the list. I think we have some idea who's on the panel, but just so we can place ourselves. This is Bitta from the New York City Office of Immigrant Affairs, Ana Maria from the Center for Popular Democracy, and we have Ravi at the end, who's an immigrant rights activist and has quite the story that I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about. Many of you probably are aware of it. And I'm Matt Katz. I have the least melodic and least poetic name on the stage. No offense to my parents who are in the audience, but Ana Maria, and I mean, these names are wonderful. Any case, let's jump right in. The video camera was ringing. So, May you start to get into it a little bit. Like the changes to immigration policy, spoken about, enacted, enforced in the last 13 months are just mind-boggling. I mean, I just jotted down a few off the top of my head. I mean, the changes in detention policies, asylees, refugees, temporary protected status ending, the diversity lottery, legal immigration, green card holders, DACA, adults being separated from their 7-year-old children at the border. I mean, when you think of this, if each of you could begin by maybe picking one thing that you think is the most troubling, far-reaching, and potentially irreversible. Bitta, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. I want to kind of just start by thanking the museum and co-panelist and moderator for this opportunity.
I should have done the thanking, I guess, as the moderator. Thank you to the museum. Already showing me up.
Happy to do my job. But yes, to get us started, I'm excited for this conversation. It's a super important one, so thank you. I think, it's funny. It almost feels like a shock and awe campaign, which I think in some ways it's like intentionally so. Kind of throw as much at us at once and see if we'll, derail part of our kind of strategic advocacy agenda because we're kind of going from one thing to the other. But if I have to sort of like pull back and look at the scheme of things, it's obviously extremely hard to point to one thing, but I'll kind of note two briefly that feel kind of super universally applicable and kind of resonate to a lot of different things. One is just the culture shift that we saw really explicitly articulated in the decision, I believe it was about a week ago, of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service to change their mission statement. And they changed their mission statement by simply removing the words Nation of Immigrants. So it was like a very concrete indicator of what this administration thinks, which we know, but really in terms of indoctrinating in a concrete way for all of the agency staff that administer immigration applications, who they see themselves as. Because we know that's a historical denial. We just got this incredible presentation from the professor for us about who we really are as a nation. And what they're trying to do and what they've significantly, and I think successfully done in some ways, is already shift the culture and the vantage point of DHS staff on how they view immigration, how they... Thank you. Does that work? Yeah, okay. How they view immigration, how they administer applications, kind of, how are they profiling, like what does the travel ban kind of signal, and then how are they profiling? All of that matters. I practiced immigration law for over a decade, and it totally matters who is at the leadership, even at the local level, and then if you talk about as what we're seeing in terms of the dramatic culture shift at the top, it's going to make a humongous difference for people and the way that we see cases get adjudicated as one thing. The second thing is something that hasn't become kind of law or practice yet, but is this threat that we've seen and some real kind of movement towards changing the definition of what is a public charge in immigration kind of processes. So this is hugely important because what the immigration services do and what the State Department does is they evaluate to see if you're eligible for immigration. Whether or not you are currently, or have been a public charge on the state or the city or federal government in some way, or you're likely to be. And when you think about what that means, you're talking about the utilization of any benefits that people might be eligible for that are administered by government. So you're talking about kind of food pantries, you're talking about health services, you're talking about free food programs, you're talking about kind of prenatal care or Medicaid, this expansive list of ways that for us as a city, we locally seek to serve all New Yorkers regardless of status. But if they shift the definition as they have signaled they will, it means that the utilization of any single number of these programs or benefits would essentially make somebody ineligible to become a permanent resident. That alone is hugely concerning, not just for immigrant communities, but for everybody as a whole when you think about public health and safety and the consequences of all of that. And what they've threatened is it's not just your utilization of those benefits, but your U.S. citizen child's utilization of those benefits. So imagine what that means. We're already seeing, I think just this afternoon, there was a New York Times report on what the immediate chilling effects have been, an uptick on WIC programs and things like that because there's been a leaked proposal. But what this consequentially means down the road is hugely concerning and something we are certainly keeping a close eye on.
That means like school lunch, for example, right? Free school lunch, Head Start.
Vaccinations.
All of it.
Ana Maria, if there's one thing that is most troubling to you about what's gone down over the last 13, 14 months?
So, I mean, I would agree with Bitta that it is really what's most troubling is that despite the history that we just saw here, which is clearly a history that's rooted in what I think we all think is kind of a fundamental freedom as a human, which is to have a home. It's not like the sky, it's just the floor. Like that's, we all expect to have a place we call home. And if that place is not safe, if in that place I cannot feed my family, we expect the freedom to move to a place where we can be safe and feed our family. And this country, but not just this country, kind of the world has been constructed in that way. And what I find most troubling is that this administration has, well, President Trump campaigned with absolute kind of shameless clarity on this and then proceeded to very quickly implement a vision of a country that doesn't recognize that history, kind of redefine who we are in our fundamental values by changing the statement, a statement that all of us would kind of not, anyone who's not very political would say, yeah, like that's kind of the US is a nation of immigrants. That has been our narrative forever. So really, it's a very kind of deliberate and rapid fire effort to implement policies to really amass and use the power of the executive office to implement all kinds of policies that create, that redefine who we are, who the government is in relation to the people that live here, and that really disrupt the relationships of kind of recognition as being part of the same nation for people across the country. And we see it, I was kind of in disbelief when the administration ended TPS, a program, a temporary protected status, a program that is specific to particular nations that have had war or national disaster. So people from El Salvador were welcomed into the United States 20 years ago and have roots here, build their families here, and now are being told, well, never mind, like you thought this country was your home? Nope, this country is no longer your home. Go back to a place you have no connection to anymore, or a very faint connection. So I would say the shameless and the very rapid fire, shameless effort to use the executive power to change the policy landscape, to disrupt that people's ability to have a home, to have roots. And then really also the effort to disrupt any possible bipartisan agreement. Around DACA, we saw it many, many times. Trump sabotaged every effort that really would allow the legislative branch of our federal government to advance a solution to a crisis he created when he ended DACA. So it's both kind of amassing power at the federal level and disrupting the People's Congress power to resolve the problems that he's constantly creating, so that those crises cannot be resolved. So that's, I would say, the thing that I find most striking about this moment.
Ravi.
Sorry, I have to be the bearer of bad news. It's a joke, sorry. I make bad jokes. The one problem, which is not recent actually, this is part of the creation of what we are seeing, is the creation of an agency that no one has control over. No one is accountable, that they are not accountable to, and that has complete autonomy in this country to run its program, without having anyone say you have to stop. And that agency is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, because what has been happening through this agency, you have the militarization of the United States of America. Right? That is key. This agency, why do I say there is no accountability? Well, if you look at the court cases that we have been seeing recently, they will, whenever we submit a motion, they will immediately go into the court and say, you have no jurisdiction over me. This is an Article 3, third branch of government, right? Has no jurisdiction over Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Fine. We have had 30 Congress people, and I'm using myself as an example. I'm going to use 2 examples, myself, where 30 Congress people signed a letter saying to ICE, please release Ravi from detention. They refused. More importantly, the House Judiciary, there was a private bill submitted to the House Judiciary, and the House Judiciary sent a letter to Immigration and Customs Enforcement saying, we are reviewing this bill, do not remove this gentleman. The following day, he was deported. So this agency has no accountability to any branch of government. And if you look at the decision by the Catherine Forrest, right? The judge who issued the decision on to release me from detention, she said that we are becoming very close to countries that revile by the use of laws that are reprehensible. I'm obviously I'm not quoting her word for word. And that is where we are. And what does that mean? Well, we look at it, I come back to the militarization of our country. We have 100 miles from the border, Customs and Border Patrol can act without checks. You have drones, and you have, when I was in Arizona in November or October, and I was in Phoenix airport waiting to come back to New York, and every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you heard a military plane flying out. We didn't see it, but you know it. You know it's a jet, right? You heard it flying out. You sat in the plane because the plane couldn't move because there was military planes coming in and out, dead zones. So you have a massive buildup of military on the border, especially in the south. And we have the continuing increase of immigration officers. I think it's like 20,000 immigration officers right now in the country. That's New York City has the 7th largest army in terms of the NYPD, but so they are probably pretty close to that. But what does this mean? It means that if an agency can act without checks and balances, how does it affect you? And there are many instances and examples I can give on how it is affecting your civil rights. Not only, I've been living under terror I've been fighting immigration since 2006, fighting the federal government since 2000. So for 18 years, I've been battling this, I've been in this battle. So this fear and the fear of many people, they've been living like this since 20, 30, 40 years. So it is not just about us, but they're using this, the rhetoric, to implement policies that are destroying what we're standing for. And that is what is the most destructive thing about what we have to see and we have to be careful of right now.
Thanks. Mae, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the immigration regulation in this country operates under a doctrine called the plenary power, which is that it's not governed by the Constitution. It is outside the Constitution. It considers immigration a matter of national security, and therefore it's not subject to constitutional protections. So ICE can do and is doing what it will. What I want to say is, I think as I look back at the last year, what became increasingly clear is a number of things. One is that the president is playing to his base with a white nationalist narrative about who deserves to be an American and who does not. Now, he has when he first took office, a lot of us thought, well, he can't deport 11 million people. Well, he doesn't have to. He just has to terrorize 11 million people by selectively deporting people in these spectacular ways, right? People have, in a cafe, people in a convenience store, people on the steps of a courthouse, whatever, right? This is terror. This is terror. So we've had a real uptick in the number of deportations, but they don't have to care about 11 million people, 10 million people. They just have to terrorize those people. The other thing is that you probably have read the agenda to limit legal immigration. Now, what does that mean? Okay, we all laugh when they say, well, nobody in Norway wants to come to the United States, right? Why would they? They have a welfare state over there. They have free health care, et cetera, et cetera. More important, though, this is a signal that he's giving to conservatives and to the white nationalist agenda that we only want a certain kind of immigrant. It's really BS, because if they want people with skills, the people who are coming to this country who have skills are coming from places like India, right, the Philippines, right, Africa. But more important, you cannot just have people with high skills coming to this country. Who is going to pick the lettuce? Who is going to work in the restaurants, washing the dishes? It's going to create more undocumented migration, more people who will live in terror, more people who will be able to be controlled by industry and by the authorities. So by saying we want to limit legal migration is to strip migrant immigrants here from being able to have their families come over, right? The so-called chain migration. Chain migration is an objective phenomenon. It's as old as immigration itself. Trump's whole family came through chain migrations, right? But it's a way, now he's kind of weaponized that term to make it seem that people only come here so they can bring a whole village or a whole country trailing behind them. That's not true, right? So by demonizing immigrants and their family members and saying we only want a certain kind of ideal immigrant, which is a fantasy figure, the ideal immigrant doesn't exist in our world, what will happen is that the terror of the 10 million will just increase. Right? It will not, to say we want only legal immigration and we're going to stop illegal immigration through ICE, it doesn't actually work that way in practice. So I think that what we see is really a war on immigrants, on their communities. And I'll just say, when he was elected, I had nightmares. I'm sure half this room, maybe everybody had nightmares. My nightmare was that they were going to roll up to my campus with trucks and German Shepherds and drag all the students out who were immigrants. And now I realize they don't have to do that. It's just a thought that they might do that. It has everybody frightened. I think it really behooves us, and a lot of us, we're in the, I'm a member of the middle class. I can go on with my life, and it doesn't affect me directly. But this is what's going on around us, and I think in this city, people have really found a lot of creative ways to push back against this trend.
Quick comment, Matt. My wife would say I'm the ideal immigrant, so I just wanted to point that out. Right? I'm the ideal immigrant to my wife, who is in the audience.
Ravi's the ideal immigrant. Got it.
The other thing is, I actually agree with Mae that because if you look at the documents that I submitted in an affidavit, they war-gamed the way they took me out. They war-gamed. The words they use is war-gamed.
War game.
Yes. It is written, it is documented, it's a war game. And this is about war game, and it's about psychological warfare, as you said, because it is about terrorizing. It is about creating so much fear that people are debilitated. And that goes back to the militarization and everything that we are seeing.
I have questions for each of you, and I just want to stay with you to begin with, because it picks up on what you were saying. I've covered as a reporter ICE check-ins. When people have been here for years, they just have to come every year, and they literally just go into ICE and check in, and then they're free to go, and that's started to change. But when I've covered some high-profile check-ins of people who have a particularly heartbreaking story, and at least in Newark and some in New York, if there's a lot of people outside, we've noticed that sometimes the person goes in for the check-in and gets to come back out with all the supporters and their family and go home. In your case, you went with an army of activists for your check-in, and you were, and they nearly deported you. So what is the grassroots activism doing? Is it helping keeping people out, or is ICE starting to target activist leaders like yourself to sort of like cut the head off of this movement? What is happening with the pushback? Are the people in the streets doing anything to to push back against ICE in any way?
So that's two questions, actually. The first question is about taking away the leadership, and that there is an intent on that, so that there was a recent FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, out in Seattle against Maru, who was just recently targeted by ICE. And they said that it came to their attention because she was a public figure. She was on the media, etc. And we have been seeing that if you speak up, you're going to be targeted. So what does that do? It obviously calls the First Amendment free speech of this country, that if you choose to talk about how bad it is, or if you talk about helping someone, we are going to take you out. That's one aspect of it. In my particular case, because I usually do go with an army, I will change that. I'm not a military person. I would say a sea of people. Okay. All right. They war game how they were taking me out. Right. They knew we were going to have lots of people and tons of people. So it was, how do we stop the elected officials? How do we stop the fake leaders? How do we stop the grandmothers who were out there who got arrested on January 11? For them, that wasn't the issue. For them, it was about, if we take Ravi away and Ravi has all the support, how does it demoralize everyone else? Right? So it just wasn't about me, but it's about coming back to me about the warfare, creating terror. It is now showing other immigrants, you have no chance at all. And that's why they work so hard to literally take me out. You know, when they were taking me from the hospital to the airport, I was escorted by at least 10 vehicles. I was sitting alone with 4 ICE officers around me in a car, and then there were cars in front of, SUVs, in front and back with sirens and flashing lights, 10 of them.
Including NYPD, they effectively deputized the local police to be the muscle in these situations. Yeah.
And that's the other aspect of, even though we call ourselves a sanctuary city, it was so easy for the local PD to get co-opted into the space, because it's all about the G.I. Joe effect, the camaraderie about these law enforcement who are saving the United States from the person who's making $10 an hour. They want to get rid of. So I'll stop here, and I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned sanctuary cities, which is a perfect segue, because I wanted to ask Ana Maria about that. Apparently tomorrow, Attorney General Jeff Sessions is supposed to make some sort of announcement about sanctuary cities. I imagine that's some sort of new crackdown. But it's sort of a limited term, technically. I mean, it doesn't, people think it means immigrants are totally safe in a sanctuary city. That's not exactly what it means. It generally just applies to those who've been arrested, and dictates when and how they're turned over to the feds if they're undocumented. But is there a broader way to look at a sanctuary city? I mean, do you have some ideas of what like a perfect sanctuary city in this environment would be? I mean, Brooklyn, for example, prosecutors are supposed to be asking for judges to charge immigrants in a way that doesn't alert ICE to the fact that they've been charged with a crime, which will then protect them from deportation after they've been adjudicated in local court. So what would your ideal sanctuary city look like in this environment, realistically?
Okay, so the sanctuary cities term really started being used a long time ago, inspired kind of by the sanctuary movement of the 80s, of people that protect.
Started in 2009 for the ICE Auto Rikers campaign that we initiated together.
No, okay.
But
so
the term sanctuary.
The
though,
term sanctuary
comes
is what I
from-
mean. The
yeah.
term sanctuary inspired by the sanctuary movement, but the kind of the effort to get cities to use their local authority to stop subsidizing the federal government's encroachment through ICE. So many cities, including New York, participated in all kinds of collaboration with the federal government. Like, it used to be that ICE had an office inside the correctional facilities here, and so it had easy access to people who were waiting for their day in court. And there were other forms of subsidization, of using the city taxes, the taxes that all of us are paying, that are supposed to be for city services, to help the federal government detain people after their day in court. And at the city's taxpayers' expense. So there has been kind of a movement across the country, different cities kind of experimenting with their powers to prevent that kind of collaboration and subsidization. That's what became a sanctuary city. It was essentially kind of around limiting, once people were in detention, once people were in a city jail or in the hands of law enforcement, handing people over to ICE. But I would say that in this moment, the attack on sanctuary cities is both an attack on immigrants as much as an attack on democracy. It's an attack on people's ability to elect city mayors and legislators who will stand up for immigrants and who will use their power to protect the people that live in their cities. So, there have been, over the past year plus, threats by Sessions Office to, put the Austin council member in jail, or, these kind of attacks are coming both from the federal government and from state governments. In Texas in particular, there was a big battle around the Texas governor trying to limit the power of cities to enact sanctuary policies. But it is true that cities only have a limited power. Like, what Trump is doing by doing raids in LA is precisely saying, you think you live in a sanctuary? Let me show you where you live. You live in the United States of Trump, and I'm gonna come get you and 150 of your neighbors and terrorize you, just to implement a regime of terror. You think your city can protect you? Your city cannot protect you. That's why they're so upset when the mayor of Oakland just went on the news and said, hey, ICE is coming, hide, like, don't open the door. Because that actually...
And it happened, they were coming, yeah.
And it worked. And they were coming. So I would say a sanctuary city is a city where the people we elect are willing to actually do that, to use not just their legislative power, not just their kind of power through the agencies, but their power through their access to media and the bully pulpit, to say, I stand with you and I will do whatever it takes to protect you. And that means I will also limit any kind of, I will use my power to limit any kind of involvement of people with the criminal justice system. Because that's really the kind of the pipeline to deportation for most people is, so we think that a sanctuary city is a city that has policies where people who are caught for, drug possession do not end up in a city jail. It's a city where the police agents stationed in schools are not kind of criminalizing young people and doing things that land them in a city jail. So there are lots of policies that are not specifically about immigration that cities control, and that a sanctuary city kind of broadly will has the power to enact. But really, we think that in these moments when both the federal government and in so many places the state governments are not friendly to immigrants, cities are kind of our ring of fire, are like front line of defense. And so we need to both demand of city governments to be that, and by making that demand, we are actually not just protecting each other and immigrant communities, but protecting our democracy. Because ultimately, what's at stake here is kind of our collective ability to hold government accountable and to have government protecting us.
Can I just add to that? I mean, that's wonderful, and I agree with you completely. The thing I want to just point out is that, you know, the Trump administration and the Attorney General, they all say that sanctuary cities are breaking the law. That's actually the opposite is the case. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that the federal government cannot compel states or local jurisdictions to enforce federal laws. It's called the Anticommandeering principle. And it cannot threaten to take away federal funding from local jurisdictions because that jurisdiction refuses to cooperate with federal law enforcement. So this is interesting because the most recent cases that went before the Supreme Court were actually brought by conservatives, right? The Brady gun law, which is a federal law, required states to do background checks. That was struck down by Scalia and the Supreme Court by saying the federal government cannot force states or cities to enforce federal laws. So when the city says, we do not cooperate with ICE detainer policy, we are completely within the law. And to try to compel local jurisdictions or threaten to take away your highway money or whatever, if you don't do it, is not lawful. And so this has already been found in the federal district courts, right? There was a suit by San Francisco and I think Santa Clara County. So this is, you know, and if you think about it, they cannot really, I mean, they're already terrorizing millions of people. But what we can do to stem that by refusing to cooperate is tremendous. We can stop a lot of it. They cannot deport more people without. I'm actually surprised that NYPD escorted your car. They should not have done that. That's not the mayor's policy.
Yep.
Let's ask Bitta about this because what I mean, not to put you on the spot, but what are local governments doing, and specifically New York City, in terms of protecting immigrants? And if I go a step further, when it comes to resources like governments that are helping pay for lawyers for undocumented immigrants, how do city officials grapple with, okay, we need to provide subsidized affordable housing to residents who have lived here for generations, who were born here. How do we balance that with the need to also provide attorneys for immigrants? So what are cities doing, and how do you kind of make those value judgments?
Yeah, so that, is this on? Yeah? No? Just turn it off. Okay, great. So thanks, there's a lot there. I will do my best to unpack. You know, I guess I'll start by saying it's an exciting time for cities and for local governments in that there is this reality of sort of what the role that cities can play in this moment to safeguard what, by and large, most cities across this country feel, which is that immigrants live in our cities. They are a part of who we are and how our cities function. They give back to our economies. They are our family members, kind of neighbors. They have children in schools, right? So if you're talking about governance of your population and the health and well-being and safety of all of your residents, there's no way that any real city can think about that without thinking about the immigrant population in a real way, policies, programs, et cetera. And that's why you have this galvanized kind of, honestly, movement of cities. We help lead a coalition called Cities for Action, which has over 150 mayors and county leaders across this country. Every major city is a part of it. And it is about sort of both sharing best practices on what cities can do to become more inclusive, more welcoming, lift barriers to access to services and just general fairness and equity for immigrants, as well as advocate holistically together for policies at the state and federal level that we know would advance the well-being of our cities. And the fact that you have such a coalition that is active and kind of working towards that agenda, I think really speaks to the will of cities in this moment. And in response to kind of Jeff Sessions saying, I'm going to have this announcement in Sacramento, you saw the mayor of Sacramento, who's a part of our coalition, come out with an incredible statement that sort of said, you have no real agenda other than to kind of threaten our people, right? And I think that tells you kind of where leadership at these levels are. In terms of how that plays out practically, right, on the ground, I appreciate kind of Ana Maria saying there are kind of limits to where the city's powers are in that we don't control immigration. That squarely falls within the realm of the federal government. And so it's kind of on us to look at, okay, so then what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of limiting cooperation with immigration and customs enforcement? So New York City passed a detainer bill at the end of 2014 after kind of years of advocacy from the grassroots level and immigrant rights activists saying, why the hell is ICE in Rikers, right? Why is there, you're not even making them work for it, right? There's this direct, and ICE is now out of Rikers, right? And there's a limit to how we cooperate in that way. We recently worked with the city council to pass legislation that speaks to the use of city resources in cooperation or furtherance of kind of immigration enforcement. Those policies, in effect, are by and large what the city's policies are, but we've codified them through this local law and are working with sister agencies to ensure that there are clear policies that staff have been trained on and sort of in this moment are kind of up to speed on how to respond to. That's hugely impactful and important. Of course, there are other kind of things that cities look at and think about, where I started in terms of access to city services, regardless of status. Health and hospitals, hugely important. The Department of Education, hugely important. IDNYC, the city's municipal ID program, hugely important. All of these things are initiatives that cities can kind of both own and think through how they impact both the immigrant population as well as residents at large, as some examples, and I can kind of go into more as we get into the conversation. But to answer your question of like, how do you then decide kind of where city money goes or kind of make decisions about legal services, you know, there's no right to counsel at the federal immigration level, which is in some ways unfathomable for those of us who kind of intrinsically know or sort of knee-jerk know in the criminal justice system you minimally have the right to a public defender. There's no such thing in the immigration context, and there's been no action at the federal level, again, who controls federal immigration enforcement and the immigration courts to step up in that space and provide it. So that's left cities and states to answer the question of, in the absence of leadership at that level, what is the value to us as local jurisdictions in investing in this? And if you look at the impact of people realizing immigration status, sort of regardless of where you might be sort of in your thinking of the history of immigration and what makes sense current present day, the impact and contribution that folks can realize for themselves, for their family members, and for the city, if they realize immigration status, is huge. Realize immigration status, right? Both advancing in their workplace, greater access and equity for their families, taking mortgages, contributing in tax dollars, right? Like there's a myriad of ways that realizing immigration status has benefit to the city, and it's the right thing to do, right? If you care about keeping families together, if you care about humans at the most basic level and making sure that those fleeing violence have representation, et cetera, then that's how you make the policy decision, right? Is, okay, so then what does that mean for us as a city? And what you saw in New York City in the last fiscal year was that the mayor embraced what that meant, that we don't control what's happening at the federal level, but we do have the ability to give people access to good legal advice and services as a means by which they could, if possible, prevent deportation and at a minimum get good advice. And so he increased investments in legal services, and now as a administration, we have over $30 million of funding that is baseline. That's the largest national investment towards immigrant legal services, and even more with the council's support.
Thanks. Yeah, Ravi, and then we're going to have time for one or two questions after Ravi.
Short, I'll be short. I'm an activist, so I do not depend on government to protect me. All right, which means how do we create a sanctuary city? Is by everyone in this room becoming part of that sanctuary city. So how many of you have a municipal ID, right? That is a key component of what, right? So this is a key component of what we need to do. We need to use the tools that have been created to protect, so that its status is not an issue. That is one. How many of you know what this symbol means, right? This is a symbol we're using to say that if you're wearing this, you are a sanctuary person, and if someone asks you for help, who is an immigrant, you know what to do. And what you will be doing, and coming back to your question that you had asked me, actually I didn't answer, what are the activists doing on the street? Well, we are not on the street, actually, in New Sanctuary. We are inside Federal Plaza. We are watching them. We are looking at them. Our volunteers are in that space every day, holding them accountable for treating people with respect. So you can do that. You can volunteer, and you can go in there and accompany and partner with your non-citizens in that space, so that demanding that there is respect for due process and demanding respect during that process. So I'll stop there.
Great. We have about 5 or 6 minutes. We'd love to get one or two questions from the audience, if anybody has any, for anybody on the panel or for the whole panel. There's a microphone over there if you want to raise a hand. All the way in the back.
Yeah, Ravi, you spoke about volunteering. Do you guys have like volunteer shifts after 5 p.m. on weekdays or weekends? Or?
So in fact, Tuesday nights, right now, the reason why this room is not packed is because all my volunteers, 250 volunteers are at our offices. Again, partnering with U.S. non-citizens to help with their legal paperwork. So we have a pro se clinic. People who don't have lawyers, people who cannot get a lawyer, people who cannot afford lawyers. In fact, the legal system is overwhelmed right now, and they are turning to us because we are able to educate them for the process and be able to defend themselves in an educated fashion. So this Thursday, we were going to have one of our 18-year-olds represent herself in family court and immigration court, partly because she didn't get an attorney, but more importantly, she was empowered to say that she can defend herself. That is what you will be doing. So Tuesday nights, you can just come down on Tuesday nights at our offices, 239 Thompson Street. That's the first way to get involved. And then you'll start understanding the other programs, which is what I mentioned, the accompaniment and the SIDGE clinic and all the actions and activism that we are doing throughout the city.
Anybody else?
Can you repeat the address?
Sure. Well, 239 Thompson Street, New York 10012.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. You talked a lot about fear and terror, especially for undocumented immigrants. If there was an undocumented immigrant in this room, what would you tell them about having agency, activism, feeling strong in the face of all that you're putting out there?
Yeah, I would say the only thing that gives me hope in this moment is people's incredible courage and incredible commitment to each other. I just came back this morning from DC. Yesterday was March 5th, the deadline that Trump established for the end of the DACA program. Across the country, there were young immigrants, young undocumented people who took to the streets, occupied the offices of members of Congress, did sit-ins in front of detention centers.
Walked from New York City to Washington, D.C.
Walked from New York City to Washington, D.C. Yesterday, 100 people got arrested in front of the Capitol, many of them undocumented youth. And I would say, like, you are an incredible source of power, inspiration, courage. You're not alone. We are not alone. Like these, there's a saying, actually young people like marched with a banner with these saying hand-painted on it. It's a Mexican proverb that says, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. And so that's it. Like, we're seeds. Like, each one of us, it's really what Ravi's talking about. Like, each one of us is actually the seed for the world we want to live in. And so we just have to water that seed, water each other, and like show up for each other. And the fear is incredible. It's overwhelming if you feel like you're totally alone and totally disoriented. But when people are in community, the community is both a source of strength, solace, and also freedom. Like, that's where we are free, when we are in each other's company and when we feel respected and loved and seen. And so Trump can't take that away.
Wow. One more? Do one more? We'll do one more question, all the way in the back.
More BIA-accredited nonprofit organizations or other local entities to be trained to help assist with the immigration need that's currently here in the city?
I can start.
Great.
The short answer is yes, and the part of that you know, to be kind of totally honest, predates the Trump administration. We saw an increase in people being put into deportation proceedings under the Obama administration. And what we know is there's a tremendous amount of people, as I said, who don't have the right to counsel, so they go unrepresented, or they're kind of, for lack of a better term, prey to notarios, or people who kind of unscrupulously practice the law. So part of the agenda that we've had as an administration has been to be responsive to that very question, is how do you build capacity in the field in a real way through, for folks who are unaware, a process that the Department of Justice lays out, where even if you're not an attorney, but you're trained and you work under the supervision of an attorney, you can become accredited and represent people throughout the immigration process, including in deportation proceedings. So part of the work that we have done has been exactly to this question, which is to focus on working with community-based organizations to implement models that rely on BIA-accredited reps or navigators, as we call them, who get this extensive training, who we then work with the organization and the individual to get them accredited to be able to do this work on an ongoing basis. We separately have, or in parallel, have a project that's a capacity building project, recognizing that there's a swath of immigrant populations throughout the city who are newer arrivals, harder to reach, have less established institutions and organizations that do this work, including African communities and Asian communities. So working sort of with a target or eye towards those smaller nonprofits to build their future capacity to do this kind of work through a fellowship program, both legal and outreach. And so this has been a huge part of what we've tried to do as an administration, and I think speaks really directly to the question of how do you cement the ability for community-based organizations and organizations throughout the city to be able to do this work consistently.
You know, I was thinking that much of this conversation might be a little negative, and I was hoping to end on a positive note, but I think all three of you sort of just did that. Gave people some ways, if they feel a bit helpless in this moment in time, to go ahead and do something. You can go visit Ravi on Thompson Street, right? You can go water the seed that's within yourself, right? And you can build capacity with these community-based organizations. So, and Mae's okay.
I feel you.
Thank you. We are out of time. Really appreciate you all coming out. Thank you to this great institution for hosting us and for having the idea to conceive this panel. And thank you to the panelists for making us all a little bit smarter on this cold night.
And thank you, Matt.